Okay, I guess I'll turn my voice on and let you know what I just said. Hey everyone, my name is T. Michelle Johnson. I am a freelance interpreter for the deaf. I've been working in the field on and off for about 26 years, and I also have been teaching American Sign Language here at Tmj Only for about 20 years. I hold a National Interpreter Certification from the NADRID, which is the National Association for the Deaf and the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, as well as an associate's degree in American Sign Language Interpreting for the Deaf from Suffolk County Community College in Selden, Long Island, a bachelor's degree in elementary education from good old SUNY Oneonta, and a master's degree in deaf education from Hunter College in Manhattan. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you all face to face, but when you work as a freelance interpreter, you don't get paid if you don't work. So you tend to have your calendar as full as possible, or in my case, extremely full. But I still want to grant Professor Montoya's request for me to teach you a little bit about the semiology of American Sign Language. Before I do that, let's back up and discuss the base concept of semiotics or semiology. Semiology is the study of sign and sign processes, and signs can transfer information through any of the five senses. Now in this case, when I say sign, I don't necessarily mean this sign, but any sign out there in your world that helps transfer information. Now there are three branches of semiotics. The first being semantics, which is the relation between the sign and what the sign represents or its referent. The second is syntactics, which is a relation among signs in formal structures. And third is pragmatics, which is the relation between the sign and the sign users. Now that I've defined, or maybe for some of you, redefined what semiotics is, let me now go on to define American Sign Language. American Sign Language, or ASL, is a visual gestural language with its own grammar and syntax. Now, at one point, the NAD, the National Association for the Deaf, as well as higher-ups in the deaf community, debated about whether they should remove the term gestural from the definition for ASL. They felt it diminished the credibility of the language, but in fact, gestures are a large part of ASL. They're visual, and that's how the deaf acquire their language, through visual images. Hence, the term has remained. Now, for me to provide a clear understanding of what ASL is and is not, I'm going to sign a few sentences for you. I will be using both American Sign Language and MCE, ASL, and manually coded English, or at least a form of it. Now, the biggest difference between American Sign Language, ASL, and MCE, manually coded English, is that ASL itself is a natural language, but MCE, or at least forms of MCE, are languages that were created to mirror English. The first sentence I'll sign for you is "the flower is dead." Now, if I were to use a form of MCE, I would simply sign a sign for each word, and this time I mean sign. So, in English it would look like "the flower is dead," a sign for each word. But in ASL, we want to show a visual image, something you can see. So instead we sign "flower" and show it dead. Do you get it? Let's try another one. The second sentence I have for you is "the car runs into the tree." Again, using a form of MCE, I'll have a sign for each word. The car runs into the tree. Now, a note about one of the signs used in that sentence is the sign for run. In this particular case, this sign is not conceptually adequate because the thumbs represent your waist, the leg, the index fingers, your legs, and cars don't run that way. But remember, in ASL, we'll show a visual image. tree, car. Again, that's the tree, sign for car, a hand shape that best represents what a car may look like, and it runs into a tree. Do you see it? That's the visual aspect of ASL. Now, another big difference between ASL and MCE, like I noted, is that sometimes in MCE, the signs they use are not conceptually correct. Also, more than important, one more time. Also, just as important as the signing that's done with our hands is the facial grammar and non-manual cues that come from our face, and sometimes even our voice. An example of facial grammar would be the lowered brows and negative head shake of a negative statement, or the head tilt forward and raised brows of a question, or the raised brows when signing the object of a topic sentence, or the head tilt and the lowered brows of a WH question. And there are so many more. But a good example for you to understand how important facial grammar is, I'll sign a couple of sentences for you. Now, if I were to sign just the signs, you, come, my, house, you, that can be interpreted as come to my house. But with facial grammar, the meaning can change. For example, again, are you coming to my house? I use question grammar on my face. Raised eyebrows, head tilt. Lets that person know, the receiver, the one who's reading your signs, know you're asking a question. As opposed to, one more time. Now that's, when are you coming to my house? I use WH grammar. Do you see it? Without that facial grammar, what kind of sentence are you stating? Facial grammar is crucial to language transfer. The deaf rely on it heavily. They say that facial grammar is 50% of the message. Another form of facial grammar or non-manual cue would be a puffy cheek. It's facial, but it's also a non-manual cue. It alerts to size or maybe quantity. For example, if I were to walk into a room and there were large piles of garbage all over, I would sign something like garbage. See the puffy cheeks? This helps this denote the size of the piles. Another example of a non-manual cue is the sound from our voice. The sound is cha. For example, if I were to walk into maybe the staff lounge at work and the woman has a lot of salad on her plate, I might sign, wow, woman she have salad, cha, meaning she has lots of salad. Now I'll do that with no voice. Cha. Okay? That cha, along with this motion, denotes the quantity of salad on her plate. Another example. Cha. Meaning the woman has lots of fur on the collar of her coat. One more time. Cha. Do you see it? Okay. Now that I've given you a definition for ASL, let's talk about the semiology of ASL. Now remember when we talked about semiotics earlier, we talked about the three branches of semantics, syntactics, and pragmatics. Now let's take a look at each one of them as they relate to ASL. Semantics. Remember, semantics speaks of the relation between the sign and what it represents or its referent. Now, in ASL, we have iconic signs, signs that look very similar to the referent, or non-iconic signs that don't look like the referent, but have what I call a visual relation. An example of an iconic sign in ASL will be this one. Any ideas? Sure, it's tea, because you take a tea bag and you bob it up and down in water. Good. Another example of a non-iconic sign. What do you think? Can you see it? Yes, it's cookie, because this is your dough, this is your cutter, and you're cutting out the cookie. It looks exactly like how you make a cookie, and even that shape, round cookie. Another example of an iconic sign would be, yes, cat. Of course, cats have whiskers. One more example of an iconic sign. One more time. Any ideas? Bride. Yes, bride. She lifts her veil. All of those are iconic signs. They look similar to the referent. Now, examples of non-iconic signs don't look similar to the referent, but have what I call a visual relation. Take a look. An example of an iconic sign would be the first sign that I'll show you for dog. Dog. It's a non-iconic sign. This does not look like that little furry thing that's four-legged that chews up your shoes. And people think that this sign is the way you call a dog. Okay, true. But really, this is what's called a loan sign in ASL. A loan sign is a finger-spelled word that is spelled so quickly that letters are dropped. So rather than going D-O-G, you spell it fast. You see that? You see that movement? But now the hands turn this way. Looks like D-O-G. It's really quick. Okay? That's a non-iconic sign. Another example of a non-iconic sign will be another sign for dog. Again, doesn't look like a little furry four-legged creature, but has what I call a visual relation, because, as in the formation of most signs in ASL, a deaf person has looked at something and gave it a sign that gives it a visual relation, something that's visual that helps them remember what that sign is. So why do you suppose this was dog? Because I've seen people go. Do you get it? One more example of a non-iconic sign is the last sign for dog. Can't see my ear behind all the hair, but it's this sign, not iconic, because again, it does not look like that little furry four-legged animal, but it has again what I call a visual relation, because dogs that have fleas may scratch like that. Get it? Non-iconic signs. Next, syntactics. Now remember, syntactics is the relation among signs and formal structures. So now we're really talking about ASL sentence structure. Now when I teach American Sign Language, my students are very surprised to find that ASL has so many different sentence structures. I'll just name just a few. We have very simple sentences, basic sentences that have predicate adjectives. For example, I am happy in ASL looks like, or I happy I. Maybe even happy I. Maybe even. All of those mean the same thing. I am happy. Another example. Basic sentence structure with adjectives and nouns. Now the deaf tend to name things than describe it. Where in English we do the opposite. In English, I live in a red house. In ASL, or I live in a house blue. So, some examples of basic sentence structure with adjectives and nouns. He has a blue house. He have house blue he. Now you may see he have blue house he, but most often, like I said, the deaf name and describe. So the former option will be the one you'll see. Another example of ASL sentence structure would be a topic sentence. The structure for a topic sentence in ASL is object, subject, verb, and you use facial grammar for a topic sentence when you sign the object. The facial grammar for a topic sentence is raised eyebrows when you sign the object. So, for example, I like black coffee. Remember, the topic or the object is first, then the subject, then the verb. For example, one more time. Raised eyebrows, coffee black, I like I. You understand? All right. Another example. Comparative sentences. A comparative sentence. There are different ways to form comparative sentences. One way would be, let's say the sentence is, I prefer pizza to hamburgers. For lack of a better sentence, I would say, pizza, hamburger, prefer it, meaning I prefer the pizza. One more time. Comparative sentences. Another example of ASL sentence structure are rhetorical questions. Now we know what rhetorical questions are, but the deaf handle rhetorical questions totally different than hearing, meaning people who hear. An example of a rhetorical question for a deaf person would be, and I'll give it to you in English first. The man slept all day because he was sick. Again, the man slept all day because he was sick. I might sign, man he sleep all day. Why? Sick he. One more time. Note, I had facial grammar of raised eyebrows when I signed the Y. Before I talked about WH questions and they were lowered eyebrows, but they're different than rhetoricals. Now you have a raised eyebrow when you sign your WH word. Again, another example of ASL sentence structure, and my final example. There are so many that you could learn. I'd be here all night long. So, just one more example. Verb inflection repeatedly, to show that something happens in a repeated fashion. For example, I go to the library every day. This verb for go will be signed repeatedly with a non-manual cue called with ease or pleasure. Actually, the non-manual cue is called a facial adverbial. The one I'm usually represents with ease or pleasure. And the non-manual cue is, so I would sign, library, every Wednesday, I, and that's a sign for go. So one more time. Apparently I like going to the library on Wednesdays. And now pragmatics. Remember, pragmatics is the relation between the sign and the sign users. Now the next example I'm going to show you, they both share the same sign. One more time. But the users are going to differ in each scenario, so the meaning to this sign will differ. In the first scenario, there are two elementary school children talking. I'll sign what they say, then I'll give you a translation. One more time. Translation. I have to go talk to the principal. Ooh. The next scenario. Now to adults talking. I'll sign to you what they say, then I'll give you a translation. One more time. Translation. That country's at war again. Oh, what a shame. That is too bad. Now, because the ages of the sign users differ, the meaning to the sign differs. Saussure speaks of the sign, the signifier, and the signified. And he says the relation is dyactic, meaning that it consists of only the form of the sign or signifier and its meaning, the signified. He also says the relation between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, meaning that written word dog, D-O-G, has nothing to do with the four-legged animal, but it came about as social convention, which is basically a way of saying that that's what the word that people came up with for that four-legged animal. Now, Saussure's theory as it relates to ASL is a little bit more complicated than that. Remember, in ASL we have iconic signs. Iconic signs look similar to the referent. Non-iconic signs, they don't look similar to the referent, but have what I call a visual relationship. And a term that's new to this presentation, classifiers. Classifiers help us show visual images, and I'll speak more about that in just a moment. Now, in accordance to Saussure's theory, when we talk about iconic signs, the relationship between the signifier and signified is rational, which means that the sign or signifier, cookie, looks like the cookie. Tea looks like tea. Priest looks like priest. Bride looks like bride. Cat looks like cat. So again, iconic signs have a rational relationship between the signifier and signified. Non-iconic signs, the relation between the signifier and signified may be arbitrary, but they have what I call a visual relation. For example, remember they all mean dog. They have an arbitrary relation between the signifier and signified because that doesn't look like a dog. That doesn't look like a dog, and this doesn't look like a dog. But they have a visual relation. And finally, classifiers. Now, like I said, classifiers help show visual images. If you're unfamiliar with that term, this is an example of a classifier. It represents someone who stands on two legs. This is also a classifier. Represents someone who sits. Note the sitting posture. Or even a four-legged animal. Kind of looks like an animal. Okay? Now, classifiers that help us show visual images, they can have an either rational relation or a visual relation between the signifier and the signified. For example, rational relationship for a dog makes sense. Rational relationship for a person who is sitting makes sense. Visual relationship, this is a classifier for a stationary object that doesn't move, a big chunky thing. That's a visual relation. As I wrap up, I hope I provided a clear understanding of semiology and ASL, as well as how the semantic, syntactic, and pragmatic semiotic features of ASL relate to Saussure's theory on semiotics. I also think it's important to note that most exchanges in ASL are a combination of ASL sentence structure and visual images. But the more complex the content or the more higher level concepts or thoughts, then that pendulum is going to swing from less ASL sentence structure to more visual images. For example, say I'm in a geology class and they're talking about earthquakes. You may see something like this. Basically, what I just said was, the earth has plates, and when an earthquake happens, those plates, they shift around, and then you have an occurrence called subduction, when one plate goes into another and pushes it up. That's very little ASL sentence structure, if any, primarily visual images. Well, I'm done. I hope you've understood everything. I hope you enjoyed everything, and maybe in the future I'll see you in class. Take care of yourselves. Bye now.